The darkness in the inner cell of the prison of Philippi in the year 50 AD is not simply an absence of light. It is a physical entity. It is a weight that settles on the chest, a blackness so dense you can almost touch it with trembling hands. It smells of damp earth, cold sweat, human excrement, and the unmistakable metallic scent of dried blood. Our journey today does not begin with an open sky, nor with an astonished crowd witnessing a great miracle. It begins with a profound, crushing, and brutal disorientation. We see two men, Paul and Silas, thrown mercilessly into the depths of the Roman penal system. Their backs are shattered, turned into a map of raw flesh by the relentless blows of the lictors' birch rods. Their feet are immobilized in the nervous, heavy wooden stocks designed not simply to hold a prisoner, but to torture them slowly, forcing their legs apart until it causes unbearable muscle cramps. They cannot move. They cannot adjust themselves to relieve the burning of their wounds against the cold stone. It is the absolute image of human defeat, the incarnation of failure. From this dense, almost suffocating atmosphere, where every breath is an agony, emerges a detail that defies all human logic. It is a detail recorded in the 16th chapter of the book of the Acts of the Apostles, a narrative hook that completely baffles us. It is midnight, the darkest hour. The hour when the human body is weakest, when the fever from infected wounds begins to rise, when the demons of doubt scream loudest in the mind. Instead of groaning, instead of crying or cursing God for leading them into a death trap right after receiving that famous Macedonian call, these men begin to sing. But why would anyone do that? What psychological or spiritual mechanism is activated in the mind of a human being so that in the epicenter of injustice and extreme physical pain, their response is to sing a hymn? The answer to this question is not a simple self-improvement cliché. The answer holds one of the most profound and revolutionary theological mysteries of antiquity, a mystery that would forever alter the course of European history. To truly understand the crushing weight of this moment in the inner cell, we need to slow our pace. We need to go back a few hours and immerse ourselves deeply in the context of the city that locked them up. Philippi was not just any city on the map of the ancient world. It was a strategic jewel. It was, in many ways, a little Rome embedded in the region of Macedonia. Years ago, on the plains near this city, one of the most decisive battles in Roman history had been fought, where Mark Antony and Octavian defeated the assassins of Julius Caesar. To reward its veteran soldiers, Rome granted them land in Philippi and bestowed upon the city the coveted Ius Italicum. This meant that, although they were hundreds of kilometers from the Italian peninsula, the citizens of Philippi had the same rights, paid the same taxes, and enjoyed the same privileges as if they lived on the very hills of Rome. It was an intensely proud city, deeply militarized and above all, driven by profit and status. Here, Roman citizenship was everything, and outsiders, especially itinerant Jews like Paul and Silas, were viewed with a mixture of contempt and suspicion. The tension that led them to that dungeon did not begin with a theological debate. It began, as great human conflicts often do, with economics. The book of Acts tells us that Paul and Silas, for several days, were followed by a young slave girl. But this was no ordinary slave. She was possessed by what the original Greek text calls a spirit of Python. In the context of the Greco-Roman world, this connected her directly to the famous Oracle of Delphi, the most important center of divination in antiquity, where the priestess of Apollo, the god who supposedly had killed the mythical serpent Python, predicted the future. This young woman from Philippi had a supernatural ability for clairvoyance, and her owners, a syndicate of local businessmen, had built an economic empire exploiting her condition. She was, in modern terms, a money-printing machine, a slave trapped in a double prison, the legal one imposed by her human masters and the spiritual one imposed by the entity that inhabited her. For days, she followed the apostles, shouting that they were servants of the Most High God. One might think this was good publicity, but Paul, discerning the dark nature behind the declaration and feeling a deep affliction and annoyance in his spirit, turned around and ordered the spirit to come out of her. In an instant, the young woman's mind was set free. The spirit left her. But with the young woman's healing, her master's source of wealth also evaporated. The miracle of spiritual deliverance instantly became an act of economic sabotage. And in the Roman Empire, you could question the gods, you could debate philosophy in the public squares, but never, under any circumstances, were you to touch the pockets of powerful citizens. The reaction was immediate and violent. The young woman's owners, infuriated by the loss of their investment, dragged Paul and Silas to the public square, the agora, the center of civic power. There, before the magistrates, they did not accuse them of exorcism. They used the most lethal weapon of the time, exacerbated nationalism and the fear of the other. They said, "These men, being Jews, are throwing our city into an uproar and are teaching customs that are not lawful for us to receive or practice, for we are Romans." It was a masterclass in manipulation. They appealed to the civic pride of Philippi and the inherent paranoia of an empire that always feared the rebellion of minorities. What followed was not a trial. It was a legalized lynching. Roman justice, when applied to those not considered citizens, operated as a weapon of psychological and physical terror. The magistrates, swept up by the frenzy of the crowd, tore the clothes off Paul and Silas, exposing them to public shame. And then they gave the order to the lictors. The lictors were the officers who walked before the magistrates carrying the fasces, a bundle of wooden rods tied around an axe, the supreme symbol of Roman authority and punishment. They untied the rods and began to strike. The Roman verberatio was no simple corporal punishment. It was a brutal beating, designed to humiliate, break the will, and tear off the skin. Every blow on the bare back opened deep furrows, causing massive blood loss and sending waves of sharp pain through the entire nervous system. And all this happened while Paul and Silas remained silent about their own Roman citizenship. They could have stopped the beating with a single phrase, "Civis Romanus sum." I am a Roman citizen. Striking a citizen without a formal trial was a capital crime in the empire. But they did not. They endured the injustice in silence, embracing the suffering, partaking in the same vulnerability that their master, Jesus of Nazareth, had experienced decades earlier. After the beating, their bloodied and semi-conscious bodies were handed over to the jailer with strict orders for maximum security. The jailer, a man who represented the cold efficiency of the Roman state, took no chances. He did not leave them in the prison courtyard, nor in the outer cells where at least a ray of light entered and air circulated. He dragged them into the Tullianum, the inner dungeon. This was a black hole, often subterranean, carved into the rock or built with massive stone blocks. It was the place where prisoners were forgotten until the day of their execution, a place designed to destroy the mind before the state destroyed the body, and to ensure there was no possibility of escape, he fastened their feet in the stocks. This is the profound internal conflict we must explore today. Imagine the brutal dissonance that must have resonated in Paul's mind. Weeks earlier, he was in Asia Minor attempting to preach, and the Holy Spirit had closed the doors to him. Then he had a night vision, a man of Macedonia begging him to cross the sea to help them. Paul obeyed. He took a ship, sailed to Europe, believing he was following the direct and clear will of God. And now, as a direct result of his obedience, of his willingness to cross borders and free an oppressed slave, he finds himself in the worst possible earthly hell. Modern theology often sells us the idea that obedience to God guarantees comfort, success, and open doors. But the inner cell of Philippi confronts us with a much more uncomfortable reality. Sometimes, being exactly in the center of God's will leads you directly into the center of human suffering. The rhythm of our narrative must now become intimate, almost reverential, as we pass through the slow and agonizing hours of that night. Just as on the road to Emmaus, there was a transformative encounter amidst pain and confusion. Here, in the absolute darkness of the prison, an invisible communion begins to brew. It is midnight. The pain in the backs of Paul and Silas must have been paralyzing. The cold of the stone seeped into their bones. The unnatural position of their legs in the stocks forced them to keep their muscles tense, preventing any form of rest. And yet, in the midst of that living tomb, something extraordinary happens. They do not begin with a cry for help. They begin with a prayer that transforms into a song. Let us carefully analyze the Greek verb that the physician Luke, the author of Acts, chooses to use in this passage. He writes that Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and that the prisoners were listening to them. But the Greek word for listening is epikronto. It does not simply mean that the sound reached their ears casually. Epikronto means to listen with utmost attention, to listen with an ear pressed to the wall, to listen as if one's life depended on what is being heard. It is an absorbed, captivated, almost hypnotic listening. Think about who these other prisoners were. They were murderers, debtors, political rebels, thieves, men hardened by the brutality of the ancient world. They were accustomed to midnight in the inner dungeon being filled with curses, cries of despair, fever-induced delusions, or the unsettling sound of men losing their minds in the dark. Never in the entire history of that Roman prison had the walls absorbed the sound of worship. Paul and Silas turned their pain into a masterful exposition of the scriptures through their hymns. Surely they were singing the Psalms of David, the ancient songs of their people, passed down from generation to generation. Perhaps they were singing Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? But you are holy, you who inhabit the praises of Israel." Or perhaps Psalm 46, "God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth gives way." The words bounce off the cold stone, creating an acoustics of grace in the least expected place on the planet. It is fundamental to understand the nature of this worship. They are not singing to manipulate God. They are not making a cosmic deal, saying, "We sing, and in return you break our chains." That would be reducing worship to a commercial transaction. No. They are singing because their theology is not dictated by their geography. Their understanding of who God is does not change because their circumstances have drastically changed. They are declaring the sovereignty, goodness, and majesty of the Creator, not to escape the reality of the prison, but to impose a higher reality upon it. They are saying, Rome has my body, the stocks have my feet, the darkness has my eyes, but none of this has my soul. And then we reach the climax. The spiritual and narrative equivalent to the breaking of the bread in Emmaus, the moment when eyes are opened and reality fractures. The earthquake. Visually and narratively, the pace here accelerates violently. From the intimate contemplation of the song, we move to the deafening roar of divine power. Suddenly, at midnight, there was a great earthquake, but we must stop and observe the anatomy of this earthquake because it is no ordinary destructive tremor. The tectonic fault does not act alone. It is being directed by an invisible hand. It is a surgical earthquake, highly specific. Luke records that the foundations of the prison were shaken. The earth roars, the stone groans. Dust falls from the ceiling in the darkness. But observe the rarity, the physical impossibility of the event. The foundations shake with enough force to destabilize the structure. The heavy doors of wood and reinforced iron violently fly wide open, but the roof does not collapse to crush them. And even more miraculous, more incomprehensible to human physics, everyone's chains were unfastened. An earthquake can open a door by deforming the frame that holds it. An earthquake can crack a wall. But an earthquake does not have the capacity to unscrew shackles, to pull metal pins from chains on the walls, to open Roman padlocks, or to free feet from wooden stocks without shattering the prisoner's legs. This is not a random geological event. It is a direct, calculated, and overwhelming response from heaven to the song of the earth. It is God entering the prison, not with subtlety, but with the force of a king breaking down the door of his children's cell. The roar is massive. The panic must have been total. And then, as quickly as it began, the tremor stops. Dust still floats in the thick air of the dungeon. The silence that follows the earthquake must have been more deafening than the noise itself. The revelation occurs immediately afterward, in this suspended space between chaos and grace. The jailer, who probably lived in rooms adjacent to the upper prison, wakes up with a start, shaken from his bed. He runs out into the gloom and sees the unthinkable. The prison doors are wide open. In a second, his mind, trained in strict and ruthless Roman military law, processes his fate. Rome did not forgive failure. If a guard let the prisoners in his charge escape, the law demanded that he pay with his own life, often suffering the same penalty that awaited the fugitives. For the jailer, seeing the open doors meant public dishonor, imminent torture, and the absolute ruin of his family. In an act of cold and calculated desperation, he draws his short sword, his gladius. He prefers to take control of his own death rather than fall into the hands of his superiors. He raises the steel, pointing it at his own chest, closing his eyes for the final impact. Suicide was considered in ancient Roman culture as an honorable way out of insurmountable dishonor. He is a millimeter, a second away from ending his life. But from the dense darkness of the inner dungeon, a voice tears through the silence. It is a strong, clear voice, filled with an authority that does not come from Rome. It is the voice of Paul. Do not harm yourself, for we are all here. The impact of these words, the brutal and disorienting impact of grace, stops the sword in mid-air. Let us think about the magnitude of what has just happened. Paul could not see the jailer in the dark. but he knew what he was about to do. And even more astonishing, the prisoners had not fled. The doors were open, the chains were loose, the path to freedom was completely clear. Any human instinct for survival would have dictated running into the night. But no one moved. Why? Because the presence of God that had descended upon that dungeon was much heavier and more captivating than the desire for physical freedom. The epikruonto, that attentive listening of the other prisoners, had transformed into a paralysis of awe. They were nailed to the floor, not by iron chains, but by the weight of glory. The jailer cannot comprehend what he is hearing. He calls for light. Luke says that the jailer called for lights, rushed in, and trembling with fear fell down before Paul and Silas. The Greek word for light here is phos. He asks for torches, lamps. He needs to see with his own eyes the reality that his mind refuses to accept. And when the flickering light illuminates the inner cell, he sees the men he himself had tortured hours earlier, sitting peacefully among the rubble, like kings on a throne of broken stone. He falls trembling. The man who represented the terror of the empire now trembles before two bloodied Jews. He brings them out of the inner cell and asks them the most important question a human being can formulate, a question born from the absolute bankruptcy of his self-sufficiency. Sirs, what must I do to be saved? He is not asking how to be saved from his Roman superiors. He already knows the prisoners have not escaped. His physical life is safe. He is asking for the salvation of his soul. He has seen that there is a power greater than Rome, a power that breaks chains but keeps men in their place through love. Paul's answer is simple, direct, and revolutionary. Believe in the Lord Jesus Christ, and you will be saved, you and your household. And here is where we witness complete metanoia. Metanoia is that profound, radical, and absolute change of mind, heart, and direction. It manifests visually in a total role reversal that defies all social logic of the time. The executioner becomes the host. The jailer takes Paul and Silas at that very hour of the night, in the early hours of the morning, and brings them into his own house. Imagine the scene, illuminated by the fire of oil lamps. The man who hours earlier had brutally shoved them into the Tullianum now takes clean water, soft cloths, and, with his own hands hardened by years of military service, begins to delicately wash the open wounds on the apostles' backs. He is washing away the blood that he himself indirectly helped to spill. It is a tangible, physical, beautiful act of repentance. The water that cleanses the blood becomes, almost immediately, the water of baptism. Because that very night, without waiting to take theology classes, without waiting for dawn, the jailer and his entire family are baptized. And then, the ultimate communion. The jailer brings them up into his house and sets a meal before them. He prepares a banquet for them in the early hours of the morning. Luke tells us that he rejoiced along with his entire household that he had believed in God. Terror has turned into joy. The prison has transformed into a sanctuary. As the dust from the earthquake finally settles and the dawn begins to dye the sky over Philippi purple, our script enters its theological conclusion. What happened that night in the inner cell was not an isolated event. It was the foundational act of something much greater. By connecting this nocturnal chaos with the broader landscape of the New Testament, we discover that from the rubble of that prison, the Church of Philippi was born, the first Christian community on the European continent. And when we analyze who formed the core of that first church, we find the most unlikely and beautiful trinity in history. There was Lydia, the wealthy seller of purple, an Asian businesswoman Paul had met days earlier by the river. There was the young slave girl, newly freed from her spiritual and economic exploitation. And there was the rugged Roman jailer, a man trained to kill, now washed by grace, an aristocrat, a slave, and a soldier. Three people who, in the social order of the Roman Empire, would never have sat down to eat at the same table. But in the kingdom of God, the ground is level at the foot of the cross. The suffering of Paul and Silas was not a tragic accident. It was the stone foundation upon which the European church was built. The pain they endured was the exact price necessary to open the doors of grace to those three strata of society. Years later, an aging Paul, writing from another prison, this time in Rome, would send a letter to this very community. It is the epistle to the Philippians, and the most fascinating detail, the most sublime theological irony of that letter, is that its central theme, the word repeated over and over throughout its chapters, is joy, the Greek word chara. Paul writes to them about unbreakable joy from a cell to a church that is born in a cell. He teaches them that joy is not the absence of suffering, but the undeniable presence of Christ in the midst of it. We now reach the end of our journey, and it is time to look directly into the eyes of the viewer, to you who are listening to this story today. Because the story of Philippi is not a simple historical documentary about antiquity. It is a mirror. We speak to those who today find themselves trapped in their own inner cells. Perhaps you are in a season of absolute darkness. Perhaps you feel the suffocating weight of a situation you cannot control. Maybe, like Paul, you obeyed God. You did the right thing. You made the morally just decision. You crossed your own sea to Macedonia seeking to help others. You followed the voice of your conscience, and as a result, you ended up in the worst possible place. Betrayed, financially broken, sick, or facing the rejection of those you tried to save. You find yourself with your back wounded by the injustice of life, and your feet immobilized by circumstances that prevent you from moving forward. You are in your own midnight. Have you ever wondered, in the silence of your own sleepless nights, what to do when God's promises seem to violently clash with your present reality? The natural, logical, and understandable human temptation is to complain. It is to demand answers. It is to become bitter against heaven and scream into the darkness. But the echo of the broken chains of Philippi offers us a radically different path. It challenges us to do the unthinkable. It invites us to sing. Singing at midnight does not mean denying your pain. Paul and Silas felt every laceration on their skin. They were not in a trance, denying the reality of stone and blood. Singing in the darkness is an act of spiritual rebellion. It is looking into the eyes of your suffering and telling it, you do not have the final word. It is aligning your mouth not with what your physical eyes see, but with what your spirit knows. It is remembering that your worship is the most lethal weapon against despair. When we worship at midnight, we do not always change the prison immediately. Sometimes the earth does not shake at the first chord. Sometimes we spend hours, months, or years in the stocks. But worship in the inner cell always, invariably, changes the prisoners. It transforms your perspective. It elevates you above the level of your captors or your circumstances. It prepares you, forging in you an unbreakable character for the exact moment when the earth inevitably shakes again under the weight of divine intervention. And while you are there, Singing with a broken voice in your own darkness, remember the other prisoners. Remember that the world around you is in the same prison, listening attentively. Your children, your co-workers, your friends, those who do not know God, are watching how you react when life strikes you unjustly. Your worship in pain may be the only theology they ever get to hear. Your song at midnight may be the prelude to the earthquake that will not only set you free, but will open the doors for everyone around you. The darkness of the cell is real. The pain of the whip is deep. But midnight is not the end of the story. It is simply the perfect stage for the light to shine with greater intensity. Because when a broken heart decides to praise God at the bottom of the abyss, heaven has no other choice but to stop, listen, and eventually descend with power to throw wide open the doors of the impossible. And you, what song will you choose to sing tonight when the clock strikes midnight and all seems lost? That answer, and only that answer, is what will define whether the walls that enclose you today will become your tomb or the sanctuary of your greatest deliverance.